He had learned the art of steps from the elves to move through the air more easily, and that the protagonist could do everything. The dragon shook its head from side to side, watching Xavier. The dragon looked up in horror where the swordsman was. The knight thought that even if it was a young dragon, it was still the strongest creature on the planet, and he would not be able to cope with it so easily. A blue magic sphere appeared in space. Energy spheres moved through the air, after which a bright light emanated from them. Xavier was gathering incredible powerful energy in his blade. He swung his blade, using the aura explosion skill. The energy flow was directed towards Solidas. A pillar of energy pierced the dragon's shoulder. Solidas looked at the small hole in his chest in bewilderment, after which tears flowed from his eyes. Solidas began to roll on the ground, saying that it was burning and that it was very painful for him. Xavier stood in front of the dragon, telling him to continue. Solidas asked him to wait for the night a little. The protagonist grinned maliciously, wondering how a dragon could be so afraid of a man, adding that it seemed that this was exactly how Solidas looked when he was scared. The protagonist imagined a man looking at a beetle. The beetle asked him what he wanted to die. Lloyd noted that he was resting in his room when a fly appeared and began to buzz. Splashes of water hit the beetle. Lloyd noted that it only grinned when he tried to eliminate it by spraying poison. The beetle smiled maliciously. The man began to watch the flying beetle. The protagonist noted that it then began to fly and buzz. The fly grabbed the pen with its paws. Lloyd noted that they gave the final blow. The fly pierced the pen into the man's chest. The young gentleman noted that everyone knows this is pain and anyone would go crazy if such a frightening organism bothers him. The protagonist imagined a huge bug above the night. He noted that this is exactly how Xavier looks in Solida's eyes now. The dragon watched the swordsman with fear. Imagine a fly holding a pen in its paws and attacking a person. Everyone knows this pain. Anyone would go crazy if such a frightening organism bothers you. Xavier, who was in the position of that very bug, looks exactly like this in Solida's eyes now. The dragon was terrified and tried to catch his breath. He covered himself from the swordsman with his hands and asked him to wait, saying that he needed to say something. The knight slowed down and looked at him with a questioning look. But then the lizard swung his hand, hit the ground and said that he just wanted to tell him boo. But then there was no one under his paw, and a print remained on the ground. Behind him, a blade master instantly appeared, charging a sphere for an attack and frightening him. The dragon received another injection in the back. He immediately screamed at the top of his lungs in pain and cried. Xavier continued to mock and beat him, while Soida begged him to stop. At this time, Lloyd was lying nearby and watching this with pleasure. The young master watched this with a smile and thought that everything was going according to plan and the next step was already predetermined. The lizard exhaled a large amount of smoke, blocking his view. Again, imagine the attacks of an insect and think about what if the insect spray does not work and the frightening creature continues to advance. Solida's eyes glowed in the darkness with determination. The figure of the dragon evaporated in smoke and under it was a man. In the case of an insect, you will most likely run away from the room. The monster turned into a man, began to run as fast as he could and complain in his head about what was happening. The lizard watched the knight from behind and thought that he would not be able to find him. He tried to use teleportation by pointing his fingers at his temples, but then he was struck by a discharge that illuminated him through and through. And while he was lying on the ground, the hero thought that he had set an anti-teleportation trap, and although he had been stupid in the past, today he had broken his stupidity record. Lloyd approached the red-haired man and he looked at him with incomprehension. The young gentleman bowed and asked to be allowed to introduce himself officially, and then called himself the eldest son of Count Frontera. But then the dragon pretended not to understand what was being discussed, although he was covered in burns. The protagonist tried to keep his face and kept silent meaningfully. And while Solida pretended and wondered where he was and why he was here, saying that he wanted to leave here as soon as possible. But at that moment Xavier was preparing an attack with his blade. He swung his sword, sending a wave towards the enemy. The dragon received another blow to the back and screamed in pain again. He held his back and asked what was wrong with those two and why he was getting it, to which the hero said that he had no doubt that he was the great dragon, because ordinary people don't behave like that. Lloyd folded his hands together and said that he had given the reason from the very beginning, because he was here from the very beginning to make him a very good offer. Solida, looking upset and with tears in her eyes, said that then it was necessary to talk about it right away instead of poking him so painfully. The hero, still with a sycophantic look, said that since he tried to kill them, his servant was confused and did not know whether to fight or not. The dragon looked at the swordsman with displeasure and asked what kind of offer they had. The protagonist looked at him with a sly look and thought that they needed to start from the very bottom. After all, when the monster attacked the elves in the novel, he definitely had anger management issues, and it is obvious that it is initially impossible to build a dialogue with such a dragon, so he had to resort to brute force. When in a restaurant and a nasty man overturns a table and shouts about the noodles and black bean sauce and scolding on not so important points demands a boss, then almost everything can be solved this way. But when a pumped-up man comes to him and mentioning that he is the boss here, then he starts eating right off the floor and humiliating himself. The heroes just need to save face in the presence of a stronger personality. Seeing a sad dragon, Lloyd thought that even though he still managed to calm him down, this does not change his nature, and since his pride was hurt, it will not be easy to start negotiations. And then he decided to start insulting Xavier with a nasty face. The nobleman continued to do this, pointing his finger at him and asking how he dared to do this, and who allowed him to do this. The blonde was deeply hurt. Then the hero with a pompous look made the dragon happy by saying that he needed to thank him, because if it weren't for him, they would have been burned alive. Then the protagonist, moving his hand to the side, ordered his knight to kneel and raise his hands up. Xavier heard this and was furious, but did not show it. Lloyd again made a nasty face and asked if he had hearing problems. Then the blonde knelt down and raised his hands with a lost look. The young lord sat down on his knees and offered to sit on the stone to the dragon, and he agreed. Then the protagonist bowed low and said that he wanted to ask a simple question, and when he asked what it was, the heir looked at him with a smile and narrowed his eyes. But then he made an incredibly cunning look and asked if he wanted to get married. Solia looked at him with great embarrassment and asked how he knew. Then Lloyd, still in the same position, said that he knew that his hands were not very skillful, and he could not cut the stone properly. The dragon, with great surprise and anxiety, asked how he knew about this and how they managed to find his lair. The aristocrat, bowing and smiling, said that he would get married in 10 years. The red-haired man, with an inspired look, asked if this was true. But then he made a furious look and asked to answer his question, to which the hero asked if he was glad to finally enter into a love relationship with a female. But then he became very embarrassed when the heir said that they could cut through the expanses with their claws clasped. He, smiling slyly, said that they could exchange sweet love letters using telepathy. And finally the dragon, melted by romance, imagined flying with his beloved after the protagonist's words that they would be able to make beautiful hearts from their tails in the night sky under the moonlight. The hero handed the happy monster a pen and paper, saying that he only needed to sign this, and when the dragon asked if he could get married if he signed here, he said that everything was correct. Lloyd smiled sweetly and asked to sign at the end. And when he finally signed, the heir's face changed and looked like a murderer. The aristocrat snatched the paper from his hands at speed. Holding the scroll in his hands, he asked if this was written in the dragon laws. The sly one looked at him with contempt and said that everyone knows that dragons who break the contract with a man will experience the punishment of the Dragon King. Solida's premonition did not fail. The hero stood over the deceived interlocutor, thereby frightening him. There was a wild and vile smile on his face, because right now the lizard received a blow below the belt from this demonic spawn. In the settlement with multi-story buildings, the sky was clear. The farmers noticed something strange and stopped. On the road, their master's company was walking, and the worker in the bandana said to take a look at it because the hero returned from his trip. Seeing the sad dragon, he continued and said that every time he went somewhere, he returned with something amazing, and this time this something was a dragon, which, if reined in, becomes an ordinary person. But the worker in the hat said that this was all slander and laughed with his comrade. Then Lloyd smiled and thought about what he meant by the waste incinerator. Continuing to walk with an incredibly cunning smile, he thought about what he meant by the dragon and his goal was achieved. Smoke spread around the room. Solida stood there looking sad, and then Corgidus asked if this young man was really a dragon. Lloyd pointed at the guy and said that everything was correct and said that the steam was coming from his breath, and the red-haired man immediately called them scammers. The dwarf looked at him with indifference and asked if he was really that bad at cutting, to which he said that everything was really so. The heir with a soft smile took out the contract and said that according to the terms of the contract, Corgidus would teach Solida the art of cutting stones. After imagining how the dragon burns dung heaps, he said that he would burn all the waste in the treatment facilities. Then the red-haired man gritted his teeth and looked away, thinking that he was still a dragon and it was not appropriate for him to clean up human feces. But then the hero surprised him greatly, clapping his hands and saying that he knew it was hard for him to accept the fact that he had to clean up human poop, and then the dragon thought that he could read minds. Lloyd continued and, with the same sunny look, said that this was exactly why he had to put a little pressure on him to sign the contract. Otherwise he simply would not have done it and would have lost the chance to learn the art of cutting stones, and in that case, his face instantly became disgusting and cunning, and he said that then it would be hard for him to get married, and asked if that was true, laughing. The red-haired man looked away again, meaningfully keeping silent, and the protagonist continued, saying that pride is, of course, good, and then asked what would have happened if she had not allowed him to get married, and asked about what was of greater value. Solida calmed down a little and fell silent, and then he approached the dwarf and addressed him as a dwarf, but immediately after he corrected himself. He bowed and called him a teacher and said that he was completely in his power. Then Corgidus scratched his beard and said that it was surprising that some insignificant dwarf would teach a powerful dragon. The red-eyed man looked down and said that in matters of strength, Dragons are definitely the most powerful, but then he looked at the dwarf and said that they were the best craftsmen in the world and asked to fix his damned hands. The hero looked at them smugly and thought that no matter how stupid he seemed, he was still a dragon and would adapt to the situation very quickly. The dwarf looked at them calmly and said that since he was already talking, he would not refuse, and saying that he could be a little rude, he asked if Salita could withstand it. The red-haired man, full of confidence, calmly said that he had already made a decision. The dwarf's face changed and he shouted at the top of his voice with rage that it was time to stop standing there like a statue and bring him the necessary materials. The dragon pointed his finger at himself with concern and asked if he was talking to him, and Corgidus asked if he expected his teacher to do everything for him and ordered him to move. And while the student ran as fast as he could, the dwarf ordered him to speed up. The hero looked at them with a soft smile and thought that this contract was an ideal example of an agreement that would benefit everyone. While the red-haired man was collecting stones, he continued his thought and thought that he had a chance to exchange his pride for the highest level of education in the world. The dwarf, during his training, hit his student on the hands and said that he ordered him not to squeeze so hard. The protagonist thought with a soft smile about Corgidus enjoying his power over the dragon to the fullest, and he himself had encountered countless cases. The hero remembered his past life and the dialogue with the boss and thought about when he was offered incredibly unfair contracts, and then assured that I have no choice but to sign them. Then he imagined how the bald old man stretched out his hands to him and thought that perhaps they thought then that this scum should have no choice. The dwarf stood on the box next to the sitting dragon and hit it with a stick, asking if it was intentionally trying to ruin everything, and telling it to think before doing something, and Lloyd at that moment thought that such behavior has nothing to do with a contract, because a contract is when all parties benefit. The hero watched as the precious stones flew to the floor and listened to the screams that it should be thrown away. He immediately picked them up from the ground and thought that it would be better if he got the most out of it. But suddenly a notification appeared that he had changed another fate. The protagonist looked at him in surprise while rolling a cart with stones and was surprised. As it turned out in the novel, the dragon was mortally wounded and cut off by Xavier and he crawled to his lair. Salita was breathing heavily lying on the ground, and the system continued the story. The lizard was lying under the sun's rays, and the notification said that he died there and was dying alone in his lair that no one would ever find. Lloyd scratched his cheek and said with a displeased face that the novel only said how he returned to his lair, but the system said that if it were not for him, the Frontera couple would also disappear from this world. Afterwards, we see the Count, who is a well-rounded person who is now free from the burden of debt and is putting all his efforts into what he couldn't do before. He had a figurine of his son in his hands, and a notification said that he was now happy and all thanks to the protagonist. Afterwards, we see Julian, who receives a certificate from the teacher, and the system wrote that the guy who was destined to die in a foreign land finally receives recognition for his efforts in his studies and all thanks to him, and it is impossible to count how many lives he has already saved. The hero scratched his nose, and then he asked for money with a satisfied look, but in response he received that this money must be earned independently, and when he asked for RP, the system told him that people do not understand romance at all, but he said that romance cannot satisfy. Afterwards, the protagonist thought that he needed a skill now since they were about to start building a large sewer system, and then he imagined the markings on the fields and said that the problem was in the radius of the measurement skill, and the construction would take up the entire county, but getting information from different parts of the county and then combining them was a real headache. Looking at the skill statistics, Lloyd thought that although his level had increased a little after completing some projects, at some point everything had stopped at one level. He stuck a shovel into the ground standing on the edge of a cliff and thought that the basics of business were to keep what you had, but not to spare expenses on what was necessary, but then a new notification came out. The hero pressed the skill increase button and thought that if he increased the level, the measurement radius would increase several times. He began to press the increase button with incredible speed and notifications flew out one after another. His skill class increased and reached an advanced level, and advanced design allowed him to increase the maximum radius to 3 million square kilometers. Lloyd looked at it with a sly smile and thought that it was a great investment in the form of 12 ORP. A notification about a new exclusive skill option came out. The hero looked at it with distrust and asked what it was. Then the system said that he was a person who had often expressed concern about wanting to work less, and offered to test the revolutionary system, to which the hero said that he could not trust it when he spoke like some kind of store on the couch that sells all sorts of crap, but it offered to try requesting a 3D layout plan that he had already saved. Lloyd imagined it in his hand and said that he would play along with it, and then he used the guide skill. The hologram flew off his hand to the side and he was very surprised. Then the aristocrat's face showed extreme surprise and he asked what it was. In front of him was a full-size house in the form of a projection. The system said that this hologram would be visible to him and everyone working on the project, and the builders could now work based on it. The aristocrat looked at it in surprise, his hands away, and thought that thanks to this skill he would be able to relieve himself of 50% of his responsibilities. He immediately rushed to the side and thought that he needed to check everything right now. There was a green circle on the floor. The swordsman stood next to his master and asked what it was, and he said that this was the place where he would dig. Xavier looked at him with disdain and kept silent meaningfully, but he said that he would tell him the details later and asked to start quickly. The blonde dug out a part and said that there was also a green light inside, and he said that this was indeed the case. Lloyd pointed to the edge and asked to drip outside the green color. The knight stuck the shovel into the ground outside the scheme. The light immediately changed from green to red. The protagonist's disgruntled face appeared in the sky, saying that they needed to try harder and insulted the workers. Xavier, who was looking at it, said that it was disgusting, but the hero asked if he was being too careless with his words, because it was his face, and asked